Well, hello. Long time no see. What's been happening abroad and at home? Basically, I wanted to talk about all this disclosure that's happening. So we got four options. It's alien technology, and I've got to say I was a pretty good ace in the hole if you're about to go into a war to make your enemies think, oh, geez, I don't mess with them. They might have disintegrator rays and anti-gravity craft or something like that. And honestly, that's what I thought the whole point of this was. And it's a theory I twigged onto when I was quite young. I might have spoken about this once before. Independence Day came out when I was in high school, and a few years later, when it came out on video, one day I was watching the extras on the video, and basically there was this little set piece where Dean Devlin, the director or producer, was talking about how they ran the script by the army and said, oh, you're going to have to pull out Area 51 from the script. We don't want anyone talking about Area 51. And I thought, oh, geez, this is a nice ruse. If they've got something to hide, they've got something, right? Well, man, that's the cheapest psychological warfare program you can run against an enemy state. We got shit you can't touch. Don't mess with us. And that's honestly what I thought it was for a long time. So what's your next option? What's your next least crazy thing down the list? That if it's not aliens, maybe it's a precursor human civilization. If you at all follow Randall Carlson, Graham Hancock's theory, it makes sense that we could have had a high-tech civilization around 10,000 years ago that was wiped out, and possibly have climbed partway back to that several times in the intervening millennia. There are several events, the Bronze Age collapse, a few others that are sort of semi-unexplained, where a large region of the Earth suffered some kind of cataclysm that wiped out all the most advanced peoples of the time. The Harappans, same thing, somewhere around 2,500 years ago. So this doesn't just happen on a 6 and 12,000 year cycle, although the main events tend to fall on that timeline if you keep up with any of that catastrophism stuff. Next option. It's Nazi technology the Americans got hold of through Operation Paperclip. And that makes a lot of sense when you think about it. The Nazis were the most advanced war machine at the time, and seemed to take most of Europe without much pushback until similarly industrialized nations got on board. And now this was the result of the Industrial Revolution. And what kicked that off? I was taught in school that it was the invention of the steam engine. But I happen to think what it actually was when Napoleon went into Egypt, he basically uncovered a chemical industry, an ancient, abandoned chemical industry. And a lot of the things that, despite Egyptology's claims, everybody knows they're not tombs. The kings are buried in the Valley of the Kings, far away from the pyramid complex at Giza. And however, some of the smaller pyramids seem to have function. One in particular that I heard a talk about seems to have been a coking kiln designed to turn guano into fertilizer. by cooking it. And this is something that we started to do in the industrial age. And then you look, what inventions came out in that short period between, say, 1880 and 1908 that were perhaps recovered technology. Maybe not pre-Diluvian, maybe from the Bronze Age. I mean, if people seriously don't think the Egyptians knew about electricity, explain to me how everything they left behind is electroplated in gold. Like, they had to know electricity. Had to. That's not painted on. That's not battered on with a hammer gold leaf. That's electroplating. Perfect chrome finishes on the sarcophagi, Tutankhamun, etc. They definitely had at least electroplating technology. There's some other things that indicate either they were mucking around with high energy or they had some kind of disaster. There's steps inside one of the, I think it's the Dendera temple perhaps, melted stone. It wasn't carved into steps after it melted. It was inside this huge stone structure, and there's a window near the staircase, and the stairs are melted, like they had become molten. It's not wear, because the volume is there. It's melted like a candle wax. Okay, so perhaps through groups like the Royal Society and similar ones inside the Prussian Empire and whatnot, that some people had hold of ancient tech. Perhaps some of the great houses of Europe have had this tech since before some of these disasters. I mean, it makes sense that some of this stuff may have been preserved. We found the Antikythera device. We know that there were Greeks who were experimenting with steam technology. So some of the pieces were there, and maybe more advanced pieces were there that just haven't survived or have been kept secret. Hang on. So, back to the Nazis. Either they discovered or developed this stuff, or they got their hands on what the royal houses have been sitting on since the industrial age, and they turned it into an almighty war machine. And at the end of that conflict, all the top brains that were part of that were snatched up by the Americans and the Soviets. They founded everything from the CIA to NASA. They're embedded with the military all over the place. The reason MK Ultra is called MK Ultra, it's German for mind control. They were everywhere. And, the rumors go that they had this stuff. And then we've got the last option, which is that it's not just the paper clippers giving this technology to a secret branch of the United States government that seems to be above presidential clearance. What if the Nazis had some embryonic version of this tech? If you know anything about the Bell, some of the rumors about testing that were that when people walked too close to the thing, they were torn to shreds because it's distorting space-time. Like approaching a black hole and getting spaghettified. It's possible. It's possible. There was a lot of research into high frequency. Tesla thought he could make an anti-gravity device. One of the typical UFO designs you see, the Hannibal one, I think, or however you pronounce it, actually looks like pretty similar to a device that Tesla patented that was supposedly an anti-gravity device. And there's drawings. I'm not sure if they're authentic. I didn't really look into it, but they're out there. And so basically we had this proto-technology, and the people who were working on it for Hitler were now working for Boeing, Lockheed, Marietta, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics. And they were on government contract to develop this stuff for the government, but they're the only people who can make it. And over the years, they've trickled out a few, as everybody seems to be talking about at the moment. The F-117 was supposedly flying in as early as 78, 79, but we didn't find out about it until the mid-90s, some 12 years after it started flying. So these are the kind of things that come out of places like Skunk Works. And then if you know anything about Catherine Austin Fitts, she talks about how through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, through some kind of scam involving the database that the department was using being run by Lockheed Martin, and that being somehow a means of funneling off what amounted to, in the end, $22 trillion she was talking about before COVID. And so all this money pours into these private companies who make the highest tech weaponry on the planet. Why would they answer to anyone? Wouldn't they just say, all right, Mr. President, carry on as normal, but understand we're in charge, and if we don't like what you're saying, you're going to take an open-top car ride in Dallas. So, Bluebeam's worse than we think. I've been wondering how this Great Reset was going to work. Zero Hedge put out a good article about how, these boycotts might actually not be a good idea, guys, because what you're doing is making Target something that Vanguard can afford to buy. They already own Anheuser Beverage, or InBev, or whatever it's called. Anheuser-Busch. But, like I've said before, they're happy to take losses across parts of their portfolio to make increases across the whole thing. So what they're doing across the Western world is the people who are their puppets are now being hung out to dry. The tide's turning against Biden at the moment. But friends and allies alike, what they're doing is destroying faith in the possibility of government and saying, look, these clowns, even your guy's a clown. So we're just going to run everything. And who owns all these defense contractors ultimately? Who's a big shareholder in them all? Usual suspects. Yeah, it's State Street and BlackRock and Vanguard. And so now they own almost every company. They're buying up all the suburbs. Because of ESG, it's going to be impossible to own a small business. They're crashing our economies so they could buy up all the major corporations they don't already control, or buy a larger stake in the ones they do. They've got us fighting along political lines so we don't see what's happening. They've got it set up so that tug of war actually works in their favor. And the second the public cotton on, they're going to be using their fucking secret black triangles to be the world police. It's not a global government. It's not a global government at all. It's global fascism. It's Blade Runner. It's the corporations are just going to take it. And I think in the next 2-3 years, this war in Ukraine, it's got nothing to do with Russia or Ukraine. This is America's Afghanistan. China has agreed to help this group, what Catherine Austin Fitts calls the breakaway civilization. I'm just going to call it the Vanguard Army from here, I think. The Vanguard forces will be there to step in when the American military is completely depleted, which is why, even though tensions are ratcheting in Taiwan, And the Ukraine border, they give Iran the green light. Like, people always talk about the historical stupidity of trying to fight a war on two fronts. I can't see that fighting a war on three fronts with three separate enemies, so it seems, is a wise move for the West to be making. America's the strongest and it's weak. I think Russia's being used in the same way that America's being used. Russia might have put up some resistance. Putin doesn't like this cabal of dickheads. Probably because he's got a lot in common with Gaddafi more than he does with the good guys. But hey, who cares? The main point is that all the strong leaders and all the military men and all the equipment is going to be spent by the time people cotton on to the fact that the Vanguard Army is about to seize control of the world, probably under the guise of a pandemic. I haven't been a fan of Dr. Stephen Greer for a great many years. For a while I thought he was a charlatan. Now I think he's sort of gullible and his heart's in the right place. And don't be fooled, folks. Intelligence is no protection from gullibility. Gullibility is not about how smart you are. It's about how much you've been through. A low IQ person with street smarts is less likely to be gullible than a high IQ person who's fairly innocent to the ways of the world. I mean, that's pretty evident. And so, it's weird for me to say this, but watch Stephen Greer's Whistleblowers. Check it out. Check it out, because particularly the Marine, he seems very credible and earnest. The CIA dickhead who came out on News Nation, I believe it was, who was talking to Ross Coulthart, the Australian Mockingbird journalist, I have to assume at this point, given the nature of that interview. Basically, Pfizer's also owned by this Vanguard Army. Don't forget, COVID made this group even richer than the $22 trillion they've already stolen. If you want more information on who this cabal is, and I know you hear people like Alex Jones and other people who are written off by a lot of people talk about it in these terms, but I recommend you all check out Dark Journalist, Daniel List. I think the episode's called Kennedy UFO File. It's about 3 hours long. It's a compilation of 3 pieces he'd done previously, but the main takeaway is this connection between Lee Harvey Oswald, who was constantly telling people he was about to get a job at NASA, the group of people that he was a part of that were all being put into NASA and similar groups, who were a pool of CIA types, who were all being sort of sheep dipped out into the private sector to work for Northrop, Marietta, etc. The military industrial contractors, right? Not the complex, the actual companies that manufacture the technology, to keep it secret. And the angle they take is that Kennedy wanted to share the information with the Russians, and this group wanted to remain superior militarily and killed Kennedy to keep it a secret. But the links between Oswald, Lockheed, and all of that are there. He covers it in pretty great depth, and not a lot of bullshit, particularly in that content. I mean, I don't agree with all the guests he gets on or anything, but when he's talking about particularly Permindex, which is the assassination squad, essentially, that's on the Rolodex of these companies when they need somebody silenced. The history of that leads me to believe this is the most likely angle of what this stuff's all about. Through him, I found Catherine Austin Fitts, for example, who's a very credible person, has a lot of good advice for people on what to do for pushback. Although every time I look at this, the scope of it seems bigger than I previously wished to consider it to be. It's pretty fucking scary, man. Like, what they own, and if that gets upheld, and what they could do once the dollars and the governments of the world start to collapse. Like, we need a new word for this. My friend V refers to this as megatocracy, and says it's like the worst of democracy, socialism, fascism, totalitarianism combined into one horrific technocratic mishmash. And I think he's right. It's something like that. It's shockingly, it's appalling on the scale at which these people could seize control. And lastly, I want to just quickly say, I believe I've seen one of these fucking things. At least one. Possibly three. Although due to weather conditions, the incident involving potentially two craft was really hard to describe. All I basically could see was three triangles of red wingtip marker lights in it on a very overcast day. But months prior to that one, and I have a very, very blurry photo to back this up. Maybe someone can Photoshop it and see if it's recoverable. But I was driving with my partner at the time. No, she's still my partner. But at the time, we were driving from Gosford back to the Blue Mountains, and we saw what looked like, what I would say looked like what you see described as the TR-3B, Black Triangle aircraft, being pursued by a police helicopter, 100 to 200 meters off the coast, sort of following the road. And it looked like the triangle was evading this police helicopter with beyond ease, and was sort of toying with it and flying over a ridge and hiding, and flying over the next ridge and hiding, and playing a real cat and mouse game. But it had the characteristic three smaller light sources with a large light source in the middle, and was a black delta in the sky. And it was not moving like a conventional delta wing aircraft. It was moving slow enough that a helicopter could periodically catch up to it. So it was hovering and then darting, and then hovering and then darting, flying NOA down the side of the Princess Highway. And like I said, I got a couple of very blurry photographs that I still have somewhere, and would be happy if anybody wants to take a stab at analysing them. But you can see four streaks, one fat one and three skinny ones, in the blurry photo. I was driving the car at 100 k's an hour, which was the speed limit, and my missus was not familiar with the camera, and I was sort of yelling at her, like, get a bloody picture of that. And she managed. But yeah, it's not a Pulitzer Prize winning photo by any means. This was somewhere around 2012, because I was living in Lawson at the time. So there was that incident, and then I have a prior incident where I saw something else that I also was co-witnessed with my ex-girlfriend and her housemate, and that was so big we thought we were going to see it on the news. We saw an incredible, I'm not sure if it was a craft, but it was a large circular object, flat on the bottom, like somebody had chopped the top off the Death Star, and it even had a little notch, as if it had cut through that section with the laser dome removed. And the only way you could tell the object was spinning was the notch would go around, and you'd see the notch. But it almost didn't look solid. It looked like it was made of cloud, but the clouds around it were typical clouds, broiled, and this thing was like a solid object, almost like a cloud trapped in a field in the shape of this thing, rather than a physical craft, or maybe a hologram. And we were driving down the M4 highway from the Blue Mountains to the city, and we were somewhere west of Blacktown, Prospect area, and it flew from the north, very overcast sky, huge object, seemed to be 400 or 500 meters in diameter, and slowly rotating, and like you could see other people could see it because the cars on the road were acting like they were looking at the sky. And yeah, it sort of descended across the sky and seemed to disappear towards the quarry that was near where Wonderland used to be, or is, or I have no idea, but in that part of the world. And yeah, such a big thing that I thought there'd be reports on the news, and co-witnessed. Shame I don't talk to her anymore. It'd be real interesting to run that one over. Talk to the two girls that were with me about that, but we all saw it. But the funny thing is, like, you see something that time on that scale, and it wasn't something I understood until years later, but it felt like a dream. It felt like a dream, and it sort of became slippery to recall. And I'm not sure if that was just because it was something so far outside of normal experience that you don't remember it in the same way you remember something that you do every day, like driving a car. Or if, as Daniel List, the dark journalist guy, suggests, that because of the nature of this technology and the distortions it creates in space-time to achieve lift, that it actually has this effect on memory and perception, and he calls it the apotheum effect. And I really wonder if there's something to that, because we didn't have any of those kind of effects witnessing the thing at Gosford, nor the other ones at the Blue Mountains. But that thing, like I said, we expected to see it on the news, and we didn't, and then nobody ever, like, it's not a common UFO incident that you hear about, but I would have thought, at witnessing it, broad daylight, hundreds of other people on the road with us, that it'd be a Phoenix Lights level event, and it just never was. You know? But yeah, according to these leakers, especially the Marine, the main takeaway is these things are in semi-private hands. They're being used for all sorts of nefarious purposes. They seem to have license to kill to keep it secret because of the defense angle, but the people in charge of it are clearly corrupt beyond all redemption, because they're using it for things like drug smuggling and child trafficking, organ harvesting, body parts. And according to the Marine, or not the Marine, the other guy who worked in Antarctica, they also use it as spy equipment, because this thing emits neutrinos. They fly it over your head. The base station in Antarctica that reads neutrinos can pretty much get a sonar ping if the craft is between, if you're between the craft and the base. They could literally use it like a sonogram. So there's no secrets from these people, like, and they have all the power. And I think that's what disclosure really is. It's nothing to do with aliens. It's like, actually, the world's been in our hands for quite a while, and now we're going public. Like it or lump it, you can't do shit. Maybe they're right. I don't know. Sorry it's been so long. Life's been hectic. Thanks for listening to my rant, and I will talk to you all soon. Peace, love, and kung fu. Black guy out.